Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this is number 70, and it's going live on July the 31st, another month over. And looking out of the window at the horizontal rain, perhaps the summer is too. Last week we had conversations with Linus Bio founder and CEO Manish Arora, as well as with Philippe Chambon, CEO of Silene Therapeutics. This week we're talking about gastrointestinal motility disorders with Peter Milner, director and co-founder of Renexxion. If you do have news or suggestions for who should be on the podcast, or indeed any other suggestions or comments, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com, which is also the address you can use if you want to advertise with us or sponsor a podcast episode or for event coverage. First, let's run through some of the news headlines from the past week from articles at deeptechdigest.com, just in case you missed them. There's a new weak spot been found linked to DNA repair in aggressive drug-resistant cancers. The GHIT Fund is investing in a portable rapid diagnostic system for Ebola, and researchers have given antibodies eyes to detect cancer. Taiwan is positioning itself as a global biotech innovation partner at BioAsia Taiwan 2026. AI and sleep analysis is helping with the early diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and there has been a boost to biotech in Virginia thanks to a lab capacity increase. Crystalis Therapeutics has raised $130 million for its gout treatment. The body's natural recycling system could help reduce inflammation, and a collaboration has been entered into to develop the first medicine for the newly identified Renu syndrome. Synaptic Therapeutics has launched with the acquisition of the SYN-001 program. New data have been revealed from a DM1 study, and we had an article on cancer immunotherapy and gene therapy in a single nanoparticle. And of course, you can read all of these and plenty more at deeptechdigest.com. That brings us to this week's interview about gastrointestinal motility disorders with Peter Milner, director and co-founder of Renexxion. This is an area of great medical need, so let's find out more. Hi Peter, thanks so much for joining us today. I wonder if you could start by giving us a bit of background on the company.
So Renexxion is a biotech company. We're based between California and Ireland. We've been in existence for about 10 years. We're privately funded and also have had considerable amount of non-dilutive money from partners. And we're focused on developing new treatments for functional GI diseases and inflammatory bowel disease, but primarily functional GI diseases because there's a big unmet need.
You mentioned the fact that there's quite a few conditions within that. I wonder if you could give me a bit of an overview of GI motility disorders.
So there are many different conditions from the top to the bottom of the GI tract in which motility is abnormal. It's a common link in many diseases: reflux, gastroparesis, where the stomach doesn't empty, functional dyspepsia, where the small intestine doesn't work properly, even opiate-induced constipation, opiate-slow gastric emptying and motility. And then down in the colon, you have constipation, and you have irritable bowel syndrome, which occurs predominantly in young women, and they have a lot of pain, premenopausal women. So what all these conditions have in common is that the GI tract isn't working properly. So, for example, the classic, most of them are poorly treated. There are other agents, but there are no motility agents per se. For example, with constipation, you can increase the amount of fluid in the stool, and that works for a lot of people who have constipation because of dry stool. But in the emptying of the stomach, you're left in gastroparesis with the only thing that really works is a prokinetic, and There are no prokinetics on the market. And that's because there were some very good drugs 20, 25 years ago selling billions of dollars, like Tagacerod and cisapride. But because of unacceptable, potentially lethal side effects, the FDA just withdrew them from the market in the 2000s. So where you've got a non-lethal condition like constipation, gastroparesis, reflux, the FDA has zero tolerance for safety. And as a result, it's been 20 years now, and the FDA has not seen a drug with the right safety and efficacy properties to be able to move forwards towards approval. We have both, and the FDA has been very cooperative, as have the European Medicines Agency, in giving us a very viable path to approval. So these diseases have high unmet need, and stimulating increased motility is important. But also what our drug does is reduce the visceral sensation of pain, which is integral in a lot of these diseases. Pain from the bowel, which is very distressing. We can do that as well as increase the motility of the gut.
Is this something that is applicable to a whole range of conditions, or are there differences between how you treat them?
A pro-motility agent could and should and has been shown to work in a full range of diseases: reflux, gastroparesis, constipation, IBS-C. But there are none on the market, and big pharma and biotech, it's not for the want of trying. There have been 6 major attempts at getting a prokinetic on the market, whether it's Takeda, Johnson & Johnson, large companies, public companies, biotech companies, who've raised hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and deployed it in doing the right studies, only to find their drug doesn't work the right way or have enough of an efficacy. So we designed our drug with safety and efficacy in mind, and now long term that's helped us well. But I think you have to prove your drug works in an individual dose response in phase 2 in each of the conditions, and then move on to seek approval. So we've done that in a range of conditions: reflux, now gastroparesis, and constipation. So we're now at the point where we can move forwards with consistent safety that we appear to have in 1,250 exposures. We're no different from placebo. We should be able to get approval for each of those indications over the next few years.
And so, what are the current treatments for a lot of these conditions? Just over the counter stuff?
Yes and no. There are, for example, in reflux disease, there's very good drugs, PPIs and PCABs, and they are effective, but they only work in about 60 to 70% of people. There's a large number of people, there are tens of millions of people, 70 million people with reflux in the US, and there's 40% of them who their symptoms aren't sufficiently benefited by the proton pump inhibitors or the PCABs. Now, that's because they appear, and most people with reflux, it's not that they have too much acid, it's the acid is in the wrong place. It's getting back into the esophagus. Now, having said that, of course, shutting down their acid will benefit them, but it's taking a sledgehammer to a lot of patients, and others, it's a motility problem, and it can be very adequately treated or sufficiently treated with a prokinetic. And cisapride did that beautifully, but got withdrawn from the market. Now, what we do there is we increase the emptying of the stomach, we reduce the amount of reflux coming back into the esophagus, and we can relieve the pain as well. So you've got a multifactorial approach to the disease rather than just shutting down acid. But we're going to look at the people who are on a PPI who have not had an adequate response. And so that's adjunctive therapy. And that's our second indication. The first indication in gastroparesis, there's really only one drug, and it just treats the vomiting, and that's metoclopramide. It has lots of nasty side effects. It's got a black box, and people don't really like to use it because, unfortunately, to treat the vomiting in gastroparesis, it has to get into the brain, and it's a dopamine D2 antagonist. And by getting into the brain, it causes Parkinsonian side effects and tardive dyskinesias. So people don't really want to use it. There isn't a prokinetic. And so we viewed that with Dr. Falk as the biggest unmet need. Now, in constipation, there are some very good drugs. They work. But right now, gastroparesis made sense, and PPI non-responsive good, because there's no treatment for those two conditions.
Because of that lack of treatment, how did you come up with a method to tackle this?
Well, it's a very good question. We've been developing this drug for some time, quietly and privately. We initially wanted to show in the early studies that the drug did exactly what the previous drug that was taken off the market, cisapride, did. And that had been used selling $1 billion in reflux. So we took people who had reflux disease. They had never been treated before, no PPIs. We showed very effective suppression of nighttime heartburn and reflux. We then treated constipation and showed very effective versus placebo. When it came to gastroparesis, we were very conscious all along that this was the biggest indication. But what we were missing, which we have now, is a validated endpoint, what's called a patient-reported outcome, PRO. So over the years, that was developed by the FDA and the gastroenterology community, and it's called the ANMS GCSI Daily Diary. And the good news is now the FDA accepts that as the endpoint for approval. And the good news is we have highly significant responses at that endpoint. And most importantly, every individual component, nausea, early satiety, which is filling up, bloating, abdominal pain, and discomfort, all of those get better with our drug. And they've had several drugs presented to them that they've rejected, that whereas they may improve some parts of the scale, they need to improve all of it. And that's what we call content validity. So you can use the scale if your drug benefits every part of it, or at least doesn't make some part of it worse. And we're in that position right now. So a validated scale, content validity, and incredible safety. We have incredible safety and efficacy because we designed the drug to be safe and efficacious. And the way we did that was we looked at all the other drugs and why they had failed. And we realized something that was very, very important. Our body controls intestinal motility through the release of neurotransmitters in the stomach, dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine slows the gut and it's released tonically by the stomach. Serotonin is released episodically when we eat, and that speeds up the stomach. So we knew that our drug should be removing the foot from the brake, which is an antagonist of the dopamine cascade, and at the same time putting a foot on the accelerator. So you wanted something that was dopamine D2 antagonist and a 5-HT4 agonist. But most importantly, what nobody else realized is 80% of our serotonin and dopamine in our body is in our stomach. We release large amounts of it every day, but it never gets absorbed. Because if it did, we'd get depression, we'd get seizures, we'd have asthma, we'd have cardiac arrhythmias, and we'd die. So we just said, hey, look how the body handles these neurotransmitters. It releases them, but they're not absorbed from the gut. So our drug needs to mimic that. And that's the secret long-term now to our success. Because by it not being absorbed, you have a much, much better safety profile, indistinguishable from placebo in thousands of patients. And number two, which is really important, the way we made the drug non-absorbable was that any that would leak in, we immediately made it pumped back out by having a specificity or substrate specificity for what's called the P-glycoprotein efflux transporter. What that does then is give a very high concentration of the drug in the vicinity of the 5-HT4 and the D2 receptor, giving you much better efficacy and content validity. And then 40% of the drug is eliminated in the stool unchanged. So the very thing we did to make it safe also turned out to be the thing that made it considerably more efficacious than anything else.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the drug itself?
It's a small molecule. It's a new structure, never been made before until we made it. We have to make the trihydrate crystallized form of the drug to get a stable drug. We put it in a tablet. We just recently, in the gastroparesis studied 10 milligrams given 3 times a day just before meals, or 20 milligrams or 40 milligrams 3 times a day just before meals. And what we found, and placebo, was that the 10 milligrams was not adequate in terms of increasing motility and relieving symptoms, but the 10 milligrams and the 20 milligrams worked beautifully. Now, because our drug levels aren't detectable, there's no detectable blood level, we have to do these dose response curves. At 12 weeks, we saw very nice efficacy. The 10 milligram didn't work. The 20 milligram and 40 milligram worked, but the 40 milligram added nothing on top of the 20. So we're now moving forwards into phase 3, and we'll seek approval in the phase 3 from the phase 3 studies using the 20 milligrams 3 times a day with food and the placebo. Now we give it with food, half an hour ahead of food, because the symptoms occur with eating. And right now, there really is nothing to relieve all those symptoms.
You've mentioned the difference between the different disorders that are out there. Do you have to do anything differently, or do you have to change doses or change the regimen of administration in order to treat different disorders?
Very good question. And we've worked a lot of that out, and still more needs to be worked out. We can say we give 20 milligrams 3 times a day to get efficacy. And what's nice is not only does it accelerate emptying, it increases the accommodation in the stomach, and it reduces the pain perception. Now, in constipation and reflux disease, we plan to give the drug twice a day, and we did, and we saw very nice effects. In the case of reflux, you would give it in the morning, not associated with food, and that would protect you through 12 hours of the day, preventing reflux and heartburn. On top, as I said, of a PPI in people who aren't responding to the PPI. And then you would take the second dose around nighttime going to bed, because reflux happens through the night and wakes people up. So we don't know the dose there yet. The Food and Drug Administration is asking us to push it to a higher dose because they believe in so doing, the drug will test its safety further. But we'll choose in a phase 2B what the right dose is, but it'll be twice a day for reflux. And in our constipation studies, the 40, the 80, and the 120 were efficacious, given twice a day. So we need to explore each of those dose responses. That makes development a little more ponderous. But on the other hand, with the safety profile, each of these indications is layering one on top of another and growing the market. And my analogy is we're very much like Zyprexa, which was olanzapine, which is the antipsychotic. So there were the old psychotic medications that when I was a medical student, people were locked up in psych wards and they had hebephrenia and tremor. Then along came the first atypical, which was clozapine, a great drug. Novartis developed it. It's what allowed Reagan to open the doors of the mental hospitals in the 80s. But it caused serious cardiac side effects. It depressed the bone marrow and was quite a dangerous drug. So the race was on to find a safe antipsychotic, and Lilly came up with olanzapine. They developed it initially for a narrow indication, just like we're doing with gastroparesis, which was basically schizophrenic psychosis. But very quickly when it was launched, people realized this was a safe drug, and it was being used off-label in manic depressive illness, acute mania, seasonal affective disorder. And Eli Lilly worked with the FDA to bring all of those on label. And before you knew it, it was the first $10 billion drug. And it was treating a range of mental illnesses, not just the narrow one at approval. I see the analogy there, which is we'll get approval for gastroparesis initially, but then we'll move on with the safety features we have. It's acceptable in much broader populations like reflux and constipation and IBS-C.
And you mentioned the clinical trials. Could you tell me a bit about where they are and the different ones that you have going?
Yes. So we just completed a 320 patient study between Europe and the US. 2/3 were recruited in Europe and 1/3 in the US. We did the US part, Falk did the European part, and that had very convincing safety and efficacy. Now, with the FDA and the European Medicines Agency guidance, we're doing 2 pivotal studies. These are the final studies you need for approval in gastroparesis, one in idiopathic and the other in diabetic gastroparesis. We combined the 2 in the phase 2, and we saw nice efficacy in both. But by following the regulations, the FDA needs to see a separate study in each population. Each one is 300 patients. Now we'll do them predominantly in the US, 60% in the US, and we'll treat for a year. The primary endpoint is still the 12-week response. The secondary will be the 24-week response. And if we succeed using the same endpoints that we've already proven, then we will get approved for two labels, one for idiopathic and one for diabetic gastroparesis. And in both conditions, they have a paralysis of the stomach. In the case of the diabetics, it's because they get a neuropathy, just like they get peripheral neuropathies or retinal diseases. The nerves in diabetes get damaged by the blood sugar. That paralyzes the stomach. It's a well-known condition, but there's no effective treatment. So we'll get that label. And then the idiopathic are people who've had a viral illness or they've had other problems that mean their stomach doesn't work properly. So two indications in two parallel studies of 300 people.
Very good. And what about the stage at which they become commercially viable? Have you already looked into scale up and distribution and all those good things?
Yes, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Falk Pharma as our partner in Europe. Even though they only have European rights, they're bearing most of the cost of the development. They will launch it in Europe in 4 years' time, 3 or 4 years' time, and Australasia, where they have rights. We own US and Japan. So as we get closer to that approval and we become hopefully a public company, we can raise capital to hire our own sales force who would sell and distribute the drug. Now, we think that in the 5th year of sales, we're projecting there's about 300,000 people who would need the drug. We could get to about $1 billion sales in the 5th year in the US alone. That would justify raising the sort of capital you need to build your own sales force. Of course, we could always be bought out by a pharma that needs a drug like this, and there are many of them, and they would have their own sales force. But I think we're focused right now on helping our partner Falk do the phase 3s in gastroparesis. They're writing the big checks. And then we take the lead in the second indication, which is PPI non-responsive GERD, and follow with that second indication, which is even larger. And the advantage we have is there's no competition. There's big unmet need. Since the FDA withdrew these type of drugs 20 years ago, nothing has come along to fill the niche, and pharma has moved on to other things. They've tried 5 or 6 times and failed. So you see how that's a nice recipe for commercial success. Validated target, safe, effective drug, no competition, big unmet need.
And what are your hopes for people with these variety of conditions? Is it that it will be something that's easily manageable or that you can reverse the problems that are in the body?
A good question. We don't cure the disease. We allow them to manage it and live with it. We have significant improvements in symptoms. We can get it down to almost like they don't have the disease. So if we look like a 1.5 point improvement, we have what is really a very nice response, which is the number needed to treat. So if you were to treat 5 people with gastroparesis with our drug, 2 wouldn't get better. 3 would get better on the drug and significantly better, but 2 of those would have got better probably on placebo. So what you're saying is I'm treating 5 people to get 1 that is really, 3 obviously respond and they'd stay on the drug. The good news is this is a chronic condition, and if they're in the responder category, they will stay on the drug. Now, it's only prescribable for 12 weeks initially, but with our clinical data at 24 weeks, if we show a sustained benefit at 24 weeks, at the end of 12 weeks, they can go back on the drug. So all of these GI drugs, whether it's metoclopramide, whether it's PPIs, whether it's PCABs, whether it's constipation agents, the FDA is very clear. You should only use it for 12 weeks. But if you need to use it longer, here's the evidence. And that's the sort of label we would get.
You mentioned 2 in 5 being non-responsive. Are you investigating why that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's like the placebo response is high. But to give you an idea what an NNT of 5 means, if you take a statin to reduce cholesterol to prevent a stroke, it's 1 in 300. If you give a blood thinner to prevent a stroke with AFib, it's 1 in 1,000. So we have a very good response. But yes, The two that don't respond may have other conditions and it's confused, but we make sure that everybody who comes into our study not only has the requisite severity of symptoms, but they also have delayed gastric emptying. Now, maybe our drug in some of these people isn't effective enough, but when we pushed the dose higher, we didn't see any additional benefit. It was still really 3 out of 5 were benefiting. 2 of those would have benefited on placebo. And, we're being honest about it. It's only 1 in 5 actually derive, 3 out of 5 derive a benefit from the drug, but only 1 of those 3 has a benefit that they wouldn't have got with placebo. But that doesn't matter in the commercial marketplace. If 40% of people who start the drug don't respond, then we'd encourage them to stop early. But those who do respond, we'd encourage them to stay on the drug for the 12 weeks. And then if their problem comes back again, which it almost inevitably will, whether you're a diabetic or an idiopathic sufferer, then you take the drug again for another 12 weeks. And on average, we're calculating the evidence suggests people need 2 or 3 12-week treatments a year. And they live with the disease for many, many years.
Are you planning on more clinical trials in different conditions?
Yes. So the next one up is reflux disease, where the people are on a PPI and they're not deriving the benefits. And that's about 40% of people who try a PPI. We have to make sure they don't have any erosions in their esophagus and that their lack of response is due to the PPI not working. We have very good evidence from the gastroparesis study and the previous studies in gastroesophageal reflux disease, because in the gastroparesis study we just did, 1/3 of the people had reflux disease and they all showed an improvement on our drug, even though we were treating the gastroparesis, and it was very dramatic. And why is that? Well, the PPIs do a lot of good, no question, but they don't do so much for the pain perception. They reduce the amount of acid. Our drug reduces the amount of acid and blocks the pain sensation in the esophagus. So they can, even though they think they're doing well, they can do even better on the combination of our drug. So that presages well for the studies, the additional studies we're doing for reflux.
Obviously, what you're doing is already a lot, but is there anything else in your pipeline that you're working on?
Well, we do have an early stage drug for inflammatory bowel disease. That's been a very attractive area. Again, what's nice there is it's designed with a novel approach in mind. We have 2 new agents combined. One stimulates the division of the cells in the colon, the epithelial cells, and the other stimulates their maturation. So one is a biological, the other is a small molecule, and the combination of the 2 increase the repopulation of the gut mucosa in inflammatory bowel disease. But that's much earlier. We're not at the point of clinical proof of concept, but if we were a public company, we will and can do those studies. But all on the strength of the first drug for multiple indications, yielding tens of billions of dollars of sales, hopefully.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention that we hadn't talked about?
We've got good support from the regulators, and that's because of the safety by design that we've incorporated in this drug. And we've seen this before in other drugs and other companies that we're associated with. So what's nice is the regulators are paying attention and giving us not so much breaks, but they're giving us a very affordable and viable path to approval, which means they do want the drugs on the market. We only need 1,850 people to get approval. We've already treated 1,250, so we only need the extra 600 and we can get approved. That's a smaller safety database. It's about as small as the FDA can allow. And we just got to stay the course. We have a great partner, Dr. Falk, and raise an additional amount of money to help us develop the drug for the second indication, PPI non-responsive GERD. And that's going well so far.
Is it an easy sell, given that it's a field that isn't already full?
It is. It's a very good question. The one thing we can say is Big Pharma isn't going to come along and mop us up in a hurry. On the other hand, what we can say is this is a large market. It's a big unmet need. Other people have tried and failed. We've succeeded both from a safety and efficacy point of view. And there are reasons for that. and we have no competition. So with those sort of mantras, people are looking. Obviously, the universe of investors is smaller if you're private. It's bigger if you're public. But sooner or later, once we get the drug to market, it's just like Verona in asthma or Karuna in schizophrenia. Pharma will have to pay $10 to $15 billion for a drug that was not in an area they were interested in. They focus very much on the opportunities that they see. But once in a while, when a drug gets approved with a good label, as we believe ours will, for an important unmet need, and they hadn't been involved with its development, they will pay $10 or $15 billion just to market it. Now, I'm not promising that. So all I can do is make sure we do the right studies with Dr. Falk to get it approved and people use it, and then we broaden the label, just like the schizophrenia story with Zyprexa I told you about.
When you're leading the field in an area of unmet medical need and you have a solution, things are clearly looking good for Renexxion as they push toward commercialization. And, as always, great news for patients. And so that's it for this week's podcast. If you do want to get in touch with guest opportunities, or if you want to advertise, please feel free to contact us at jim@deeptechdigest.com. And so until next time, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.